By the time Bernard Madoff finally admitted the truth, more than $65 billion was gone. Not stolen overnight or taken by force. It disappeared slowly from families, investors, and foundations, people who believed they were playing the safest game on Wall Street. For nearly 20 years, nothing looked wrong. The statements were steady, the profits were smooth, no panic, no questions. And that's what should have scared people, because the warnings were there. Regulators were alerted. Analysts said the math didn't work. Everyone had enough information to stop it, but no one did. This isn't the story of a clever trick. This is the story of how an entire system chose not to look. Bernard Madoff didn't look like a man running the largest fraud in modern history. He looked like Wall Street. He had been there since the early days, before trading floors became screen and algorithms. He helped modernize electronic trading, built a legitimate market-making business, and eventually became the chairman of NASDAQ. The title alone acted like an armor. People didn't just trust Madoff because of the returns. They trusted him because everyone important seemed to. Banks trusted him, funds invested with him, even regulators trusted him. And in finance, credibility is contagious. And Madoff understood something most criminals don't. If you look boring enough, no one checks too closely. Bernard Madoff claimed to use a strategy called split strike conversion. To most investors, that phrase alone was reassuring. It sounded technical and complex, and people trusted it. In simple terms, the strategy was supposed to work like this. Imagine you own a stock, you buy insurance in case it falls, and at the same time, you limit how much profit you can make if it rises. Let's put that into perspective. You buy a large stable stock for $100. At the same time, you buy insurance that protects you in case the stock falls below $95. That insurance costs money. To pay for it, you agree to sell the stock if it rises above $105, giving up any gains beyond that point. So if the stock crashes, you're protected. If it rises, your profit is capped. And if nothing dramatic happens, you earn a small, steady return. In a normal market, this might produce 1 to 2% profit per month, sometimes less, occasionally negative. It is designed to be boring. Now here's the problem. Madoff didn't report boring results. He reported profits almost every month, regardless of how the market was doing. Even in periods when stocks were collapsing, his fund showed calm, positive return, as if volatility didn't even apply. To make the work at the scale that he claimed, Madoff would have needed to buy and sell more options than the entire market was trading on certain days. In other words, the insurance policies he claimed to buy didn't exist in sufficient quantity. It was like claiming you insured half the city without any insurance company noticing. But because the explanation sounded reasonable, few people asked the obvious follow-up. Can this actually be done? Harry Markopoulos was the first to ask this question. He wasn't trying to expose Madoff. At first, he was trying to copy him. Markopoulos worked for a competing firm. His boss asked him to analyze Madoff's strategy so they could offer something similar. Instead, Markopoulos discovered something alarming. When he ran the numbers, they failed basic mathematical reality. For example, on certain days, Madoff claimed to have made profit using options that haven't even traded that day. In other cases, the volume he reported exceeded what the entire options market could supply. This wasn't insider knowledge, it was public data. Marcos realized that Madoff either discovered a secret market no one else could see, or the returns were fabricated. So he went to the SEC, not once, not twice, but repeatedly. He submitted reports that left little room for interpretation. He explained the fraud in plain English. He even offered to walk regulators through the math step by step. Their response ranged from indifference to confusion. One regulator even admitted that he didn't understand options, which unfortunately didn't stop them from closing the case. What happened next was procedural failure. The SEC did open multiple investigations into Madoff, but each one followed the same pattern. They asked limited questions, they accepted internal documents, and they closed the file. Madoff spoke the language of compliance, and he understood how to appear cooperative without revealing anything. And most importantly, he carried institutional weight. After all, the guy used to be the CEO of NASDAQ, and accusing Madoff of fraud meant challenging Wall Street. So they simply looked, nodded, and then moved on. Regulators, however, weren't the last safeguard. In every system, there's supposed to be someone independent that can confirm that the numbers are real. On Wall Street, that role belongs to auditors. Madoff's auditing firm was called Freeling and Horowitz, and it consisted of 3 people. One of them was the founder, another helped occasionally, and the third handled the paperwork. They operated out of a small office in a suburban strip mall. Not exactly the place you expect to certify billions of dollars in assets. The main job of auditors is to confirm that the trades happened, that assets exist, and that clients' money is exactly where the statement said it is. And that requires contacting clearing houses, verifying accounts, and cross-checking trades with exchanges. Freeling and Horowitz did none of that. They relied entirely on documents provided by Madoff himself. Trade confirmations printed in-house, and account statements generated internally. Imagine paying auditors to check your work, and the entire process consisted of them asking you, does this look right to you? No phone calls to exchanges, no confirmations from counterparties, and no verification that the assets were actually held. For years, David Freeling told regulators that his firm conducted independent audits, but in reality, he had stopped performing actual audits long before that. Audits and regulators were only half the story. Paperwork doesn't keep a fraud alive for decades. People do. The only thing that people love more than easy money is comfortable money. The kind of money that arrives regularly, without stress and explanations, and without requiring difficult conversations. When the system stopped asking questions, investors' confidence grew. Stamps and signatures created consistency, and consistency is very persuasive. Madoff's investors didn't feel greedy. They believed they had chosen stability. Some of them were institutions, and some were families that trusted him for generations. Even charities invested with him. The Fairfield Greenwich Group alone funneled more than $7 billion into Madoff's funds. Elie Wiesel's foundation lost more than $15 million. Other charities lost money through connected feeder funds. So did universities and pension plans. Individuals as well suffered high losses. Investors that believed they were doing the prudent thing. Retirees who conducted their lives based on those monthly statements. The scam worked so well that walking away felt irrational. Leaving would require explanations. Staying required nothing. As long as the statements kept coming, doubt remained theoretical. And theory rarely wins against monthly profits. The most important feature of Madoff's system was liquidity control. For years, the fraud survived because withdrawals were rare. Most investors left money in place. They even reinvested profits automatically. As long as new money arrived faster than old money left, the illusion held. But all that came to an end in 2008. The global financial crisis changed behavior. Investors stopped asking how much they would earn and started asking how fast they could get their money back. Growth no longer mattered, and funds tied to Madoff needed immediate cash. He delayed withdrawals and staggered payments, and constantly reassured clients that everything was fine. For decades, that had worked. But this time was different. More money was coming out than coming in. And unlike previous slowdowns, there was no new wave of investors to refill the pool. By December 2008, the numbers no longer bent. They broke. Madoff needed billions in cash, and he didn't have any. And that was the moment the fraud became unsustainable, because it could no longer be financed. And the system that had survived audits and warnings had finally collapsed. On December 10, 2008, Bernard Madoff called his sons into his apartment. He didn't use legal language or offer explanations. He simply told them the truth. The whole investment business was a lie, and a massive one. His sons reported him to federal authorities the next day. Madoff was arrested without resistance. Just a quiet end to decades-long deception. In March 2009, he pleaded guilty to 11 federal felonies. There was no trial or defense. The evidence was overwhelming, and the damage was undeniable. He was sentenced to 150 years in prison. It sounded definitive, almost comforting, but punishment doesn't restore investment accounts. It doesn't rebuild charities, and it doesn't rebuild the fortunes that were lost. Billions were gone. Foundations shut down. Even universities rewrote budgets. The SEC admitted failure. Banks paid fines, and executives issued apologies. The system absorbed the shock and continued moving forward, and the victims were expected to adapt. Madoff spent the rest of his life in prison, where he died in 2021. The fraud was officially over, but the conditions that allowed it were not. Bernard Madoff didn't succeed because he was invisible. He succeeded because he was obvious. Obvious enough to feel safe and obvious enough to feel unquestionable. He exposed the reality no one likes to admit, that modern systems don't fail loudly, they fail politely. Madoff didn't defeat the system, he relied on it. And the most dangerous part is this: nothing about what happened was unique, only the scale was. This is the end of today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe. And if you have any more ideas for me to cover in the next episodes, leave it in the comments. Until next time.